So, continuing on our conversation about asymmetric warfare, I wanted to talk a little bit about terrorism, provide some definitions, and maybe a discussion about a supposed change in the nature of terrorism over time and kind of what that looks like. And so, if we're just thinking about what fits into a definition of terrorism, it's an actually really tricky question. There are dozens, hundreds of different definitions that use different components as sort of necessary, and if you have all of these pieces, it's considered to be, a sufficient definition for terrorism. I think most definitions agree that terrorism involves violence. Typically, that means hurting or killing people, but it might also include, destroying property. So that tends to be a pretty important part of the definition. A second piece that maybe gets a little bit of pushback is that terrorism is carried out by individuals or by groups, not by governments. So typically, when we're talking about terrorism, we're not talking about state sponsored and directed activity. So when states send out small groups to blow up things and to kill people, those are covert operations or military operations. They're not terrorism. When states do things like target civilians, which is something that we'll talk about here in a second, which is a classic sort of part of the definition for terrorism, that's not typically considered terrorism. It might be considered a war crime, but it's sort of treated as a categorically different thing. When we're talking about terrorists, we're talking about groups or individuals who are operating without the direct control of a state. Okay, so that's oftentimes a part of the definition. We have other terms for when states do these kind of things, but we're talking about non-state actors. A third component that ends up being really important, but also kind of contentious, is that terrorist organizations target civilians. Part of what makes terrorism so reprehensible is that there are civilian casualties, civilians under official rules of warfare, as well as a long tradition of just war theory, are supposed to be off limits as direct targets of military action. So one of the things that makes terrorism abhorrent is that it goes after this, which is not to say that terrorist groups don't also target military targets. The 9/11 terrorist attacks involved strikes on commercial buildings, but they also involved a strike in the Pentagon. If that strike had been carried out not using a civilian plane, would that have been terrorism? Social scientists would debate. In 2000-ish, Al Qaeda attempted to sink the USS Cole while it was based in Yemen. They blew a hole in the side, almost sunk the ship. Al Qaeda is certainly a terrorist organization in that they do all these things, but I'm not sure that particular action was a terrorist strike in the way that we would typically think about a terrorist strike under this sort of a definition. So it gets murky because terrorist organizations will strike at civilians, but they'll also strike at what we might call legitimate military targets, legitimate being legitimate under sort of just war theory and rules of war, in that differentiation between civilians and military forces. So, target civilians, the third important part of a definition of terrorism. Clandestine attack methods. Typically terrorists do not wear uniforms. They do not march in formation. They do not have rank insignias that they display. When they strike, they're not using conventional military tactics. They're using more clandestine attack methods. They're planting bombs, or they're using non-military equipment to destroy things. I think that's fairly straightforward. Terrorists are not armies. And then finally, 5, the goal of terrorist organizations is to influence politics or society in some way. And I think this is an important one because there's oftentimes a presumption that terrorists and terrorist organizations are crazy or insane. And one of the really key insights of social science and the study of terrorism has been to show that terrorist organizations are very strategic and very thoughtful about what they're trying to do and how they're trying to go about it. And while the motivations for any individual person might range from severe mental distress to making a strategic or financial calculation, overall terrorist organizations tend to be very thoughtful. And so one of the classic examples that social scientists have noted is that suicide terrorism is used almost exclusively, if not exclusively, against democracies. And the thinking is that when you use suicide terrorism against a democracy, that sends like a really significant signal that you're dedicated and you're serious and that you're willing to take this step. And democracies tend to think about human life as important and valuable and not to be squandered or wasted. And so that the use of suicide terrorism in that context ends up being a really powerful and in a sense frightening kind of activity, whereas suicide terrorism used against an authoritarian target, authoritarian regimes tend to be less concerned. In fact, there's a really interesting case at the start of the Syrian civil war. The Syrian the Free Syrian Army attempted to strike at Bashar al-Assad in his war room, and they were able to set off a bomb in the war room and almost killed the top leadership of the Syrian regime. And initially the Syrian regime responded and said this was a suicide attack, and the Syrian insurgent forces pushed back and said no, that was not a suicide attack. We had the capability to get into the room and we didn't have to resort to that kind of a tactic. And so they pushed back against that in a way that I think further reinforces this idea that terrorist organizations are acting strategically. They have policy goals, they have things that they're trying to achieve, and they work toward those in violent and often horrific ways, but in ways that are intentional and thought out, I think is the way I'd like to parse that. Once we have a definition of terrorism, and as I said, this is incredibly contentious, people debate and discuss and disagree about all of these different pieces, but this is, I think, a fairly good working definition with the caveats that have been thrown in there. We could also think about defining terrorist organizations in terms of where they operate. The vast majority of terrorist organizations operate domestically. People are striking at their own political systems, they're striking at their own social systems, they're operating within their own countries. Only a handful of terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda or ISIS operate transnationally across borders and would be maybe an international security problem rather than a domestic security problem. The other adjective that oftentimes gets mapped onto terrorist organizations is state-sponsored versus non-state-sponsored. And I think historically the assumption has been that state-sponsored organizations would be more dangerous because they would have the resources of states to ensure that they had access to cash and weapons and safe training grounds and intelligence. But I'm not sure that that's entirely true, and certainly there have been very effective and very dangerous terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS that were not state-sponsored, and therefore I'm not sure that historical distinction is necessarily useful. But it also maybe points us to something that folks who study terrorism and trends in terrorism have noted and discussed and debated that groups like ISIS, that groups like Al-Qaeda seem to be different than terrorist organizations of the past. And so there's oftentimes this distinction between maybe old style terrorism, which maybe I guess I would put forward as like the classic example being the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, versus new terrorism, which again I think the classic example would be Al-Qaeda or ISIS. And the thinking is that they differed in all these important and substantive ways, right? So the Irish Republican Army was focused on a particular policy goal, right? It was trying to push the UK out of the Irish Isle, possibly achieve unification. Their goals were limited, right? It wasn't as though once the IRA had accomplished that goal, it was then going to seek to liberate Wales and Scotland. That wasn't part of its ambition to sort of keep moving the goalposts. It was geographically very focused, right? One spot, that was where it was fighting. It made a choice to extend its campaign to blow stuff up in England as well, but that was still within this limited limited scope. It was hierarchical, right? There's an authority structure that is directing and controlling attacks. Violence is functional, right? You're blowing stuff up because it's important. They're military targets that they're, in theory, that's going to help you advance your goal, or you strike something because it's part of a larger strategic plan. The violence that gets used is intentional and it's limited in scope, right? Your goal is not, to as the most destructive thing you can do. You're making a cost benefit kind of calculation about how much destruction you do, and you're oftentimes using conventional weapons, guns and explosives, versus new terrorism, which I think is maybe ISIS or Al Qaeda is sort of the classic example of this, right? The motivations are thought to be about identity. It's something about maybe Islam or building a new caliphate, or some sort of jihadist identity is thought to be at the root of that, which seems different somehow than the anti-colonial Irish, Northern Irish struggle. The goals are thought to be absolutist, that there's no negotiation, that you can never cut a deal with Al Qaeda or with ISIS. That the scope is global, right? That ISIS in particular said, we're doing this thing here in Syria and Iraq, but if you want to support us, you can launch terrorist attacks wherever you are around the world. Pick a target that you think is appropriate and go for it. And because of that, it wasn't a top-down sort of directing the strikes. It was much more networks. You had cells operating in different places. You had lone wolves. They were using the internet to kind of connect and communicate and share ideas, and it was much more nebulous. A lot of times the violence that was being used was symbolic, that ISIS in particular used, just horrifically brutal execution tactics that they would film and then push out as part of their social media campaign, to sort of not just sort of having conducted the attack or used violence for the purpose that it serves, but also to use it as this larger symbolic story that they're telling about what they're doing. And oftentimes the violence was much more indiscriminate. And so ISIS, when it was moving into Iraq and taking territory, conducted just a genocide against the Yazidi, just because they were in their path, and as part of this sort of religious purification process that was coming with ISIS control. That level of just overwhelming violence against the civilian population is something you wouldn't typically have seen in the past, we think, or we say. And then there's also the risk of not just conventional weapons, but also weapons of mass destruction, finding creative and incredibly destructive and dangerous kinds of weapons. The United States was worried for decades that Al Qaeda might get its hands on nuclear weapons. Al Qaeda's leadership was very much interested in pursuing and finding and locating weapons of mass destruction. But ISIS actually used chlorine gas in some of its attacks, so it was using chemical weapons as part of its warfare strategy, which is something that we hadn't really seen a terrorist organization do before, at least not on that scale and that level of effectiveness. And so it seems like terrorism is a different kind of creature today than it was in the past. And so people have speculated about why that actually is the case. And one of the most common explanations is that globalization has fundamentally changed the nature of how terrorism can and does operate. That the new communication technologies between social media and YouTube and 24-hour news create opportunities for messaging and for extreme acts of violence to be able to be effective as part of a marketing and messaging strategy that terrorist organizations can do. And in fact, being effective in messaging and marketing is really important, because one of the things that ISIS was able to do is it was able to sort of outmarket itself relative to Al Qaeda, and for years the recruit pool of people who were maybe interested in joining a terrorist organization was flooding toward ISIS and away from Al Qaeda, because ISIS had the better communication and marketing pitch. Globalization also creates far more opportunities and far more places for interaction. And so there's everything from tourism to transnational travel to the ability to reach potential sympathizers in other countries. There's just lots and lots of opportunities to strike at potentially vulnerable targets around the world and to extend a campaign far beyond your immediate reach that might have constrained terrorist organizations in the past. So there's possibly something that's changed in terms of technology and in terms of the interconnectedness of the world that accounts for this. But I think a lot of folks who study terrorism actually are skeptical about this new terrorism, old terrorism distinction, in part because you're operating in different contexts, oftentimes with different sort of situations and constraints, and the comparisons oftentimes don't line up particularly well. We continue to see terrorist organizations that operate very similarly to that IRA example. There were probably plenty of terrorist organizations that were much closer to ISIS decades ago that maybe just aren't top of mind as much, or maybe weren't as successful years ago. And so it may actually just be, what do I want to call that? A bias toward the present. A recency bias would be the official term for this distinction that gets played out in terms of new terrorism versus old terrorism. A final thing I want to sort of leave folks with is an answer, well, sort of an answer to this question of does terrorism work? And so social scientists who've looked at the success of terrorist organizations over time and whether they actually achieve their goals, the vast majority of the time they don't. About 47% of the time, terrorist organizations are defeated either through policing, which is the most common way to defeat a terrorist organization, or through military force, which is less common. But a good share of the time, terrorist organizations stop their campaigns or cease to operate because of a political process. And so the Northern Ireland would be a good example of this. There's the Good Friday Agreement, in which the IRA and its political arm Sinn Féin cuts a deal with the UK and sort of enters normal politics. That's a pretty common mechanism for ending campaigns of terrorism. But there are cases where terrorist organizations have been successful. And so one example might be the bombing of the U.S. Marine base in Beirut in Lebanon in the 1980s. The United States had positioned itself in Beirut in an attempt to, I guess, stalemate the civil war in Lebanon and prevent Israel or Syria from gaining too much of a foothold over Lebanon, hoping to kind of direct the course of the civil war. The base is struck by Hezbollah. A huge number of Marines, like several hundred, die in that strike. And the United States looks at that and says, directing the course of the Lebanese civil war is not worth the exposure to that level of violence, and the U.S. just simply withdraws from Lebanon. And so terrorist organizations can occasionally achieve their objectives, but the vast majority of the time, there's either some form of compromise that resolves the conflict, or a combination of military and police activity tends to stomp out these organizations.